The Caspian Sea Monster. Chapter 1, The Shadow over the Caspian, The Intelligence Shock. Welcome to Synapse Daily. The date is August 1966. Inside the high-security vaults of the National Photographic Interpretation Center, NPIC, in Washington, D.C., the air is thick with the scent of developer chemicals and cigarette smoke. A team of CIA analysts is hunched over a light table, examining high-resolution negatives fresh from the KH-8 Gambit 3 spy satellite. The Gambit 3 was the pinnacle of Cold War surveillance, capable of capturing details as small as a briefcase from hundreds of miles in space. But what they see in the harbor of Caspian defies their understanding of aerospace engineering. It is a shape so massive it seems to distort the perspective of the photograph. The analysts are looking at a fuselage that measures nearly 100 meters in length, longer than a football field. It has short, stubby, squared-off wings that appear far too small to lift such a behemoth. But most puzzling are the engines. Not 2, not 4, but 10 massive turbojets. 8 are mounted in a strange cluster right behind the cockpit, and 2 are positioned on the tail. The intelligence community is paralyzed. In their reports, they codename it Project West Wing. Some argue it's a high-speed transport ship. Others insist it's a strategic bomber that has lost its wings in a crash. They finally settle on a name that would haunt the Pentagon for decades: the Caspian Sea Monster. For the Soviets, this was the KM Ekranoplan, or prototype ship. It wasn't designed to conquer the skies, nor was it meant to plow through the waves. It was designed to live in the in-between aerodynamic loophole that promised to revolutionize naval warfare and transport forever. This was the birth of the Ekranoplan. Like this video if you learned something. Comment your thoughts below and subscribe for more fascinating stories. Chapter 2, Rostislav Alexeyev, the architect of frictionless speed. To understand the KM, we must look at the mind of Rostislav Alexeyev. Born in 1916, Alexeyev was a man obsessed with the concept of friction. In fluid dynamics, water is the enemy. It is roughly 800 times denser than air. A ship moving through water is constantly fighting a losing battle against drag. Alexeyev's early career was defined by the development of hydrofoils. By placing wings beneath the hull of a ship, he could lift the vessel out of the water as it gained speed, drastically reducing resistance. His Raketa and Meteor hydrofoils became the pride of the Soviet civilian fleet, turning the Volga River into a high-speed highway. But Alexeyev wanted more. He realized that even hydrofoils had a speed ceiling. At roughly 60 knots, a phenomenon called cavitation occurs. Low-pressure bubbles form on the foils, causing them to vibrate, erode, and lose lift. To go faster, Alexeyev realized he had to leave the water entirely, but he didn't want to become a traditional aircraft manufacturer. He discovered that by staying extremely close to the surface, he could exploit the wing-in-ground (WIG) effect. But Alexeyev faced a massive bureaucratic hurdle. The Soviet Navy thought he was building planes, and the Soviet Air Force thought he was building ships. Neither wanted to fund him. His breakthrough came through a daring political move. He befriended Sergei Khrushchev, an engineer and the son of the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev. In 1962, Alexeyev gave the premier a demonstration of a small-scale Ekranoplan. Khrushchev was mesmerized. He saw a craft that could bypass NATO's blue water naval dominance. He gave Alexeyev his own design bureau, the TSKB-PSPK, and a mandate: build the largest craft the world has ever seen. Chapter 3, The Physics of the Cushion, Ground Effect Decoded. Why did the Caspian Sea Monster work? Let's look at the science. When a traditional airplane flies, it creates high pressure under the wing and low pressure above it. At the wingtips, this high-pressure air tries to curl around to the top, creating wingtip vortices. These vortices are the primary source of induced drag. However, when a wing flies at an altitude less than its own chord, the width of the wing, a miraculous thing happens. The ground, or in this case, the sea, physically blocks those vortices from forming. The air is trapped beneath the wing, compressed into a high-pressure cushion. The efficiency of this can be expressed through the lift coefficient. As the height, h, above the surface decreases, the lift increases significantly without a proportional increase in fuel consumption. In this equation, ρ represents the air density, v the velocity, and s the surface area of the wing. For the KM, the surface area was colossal. By flying just 3 to 5 meters above the water, the KM could carry a 540-ton takeoff weight. But there was a catch: stability. In the ground effect zone, the center of pressure shifts constantly. If the nose pitches up just a few degrees too high, the craft leaves the cushion and stalls. If it pitches down, it slams into the water at 500 kilometers per hour. Alexeyev's genius was in the tail design, a massive horizontal stabilizer placed high above the spray to counteract these pitching moments. It was a delicate, dangerous balance of fluid dynamics and raw power. Chapter 4, 1967, The Caspian Trials and the Logistics of Secrecy. By late 1966, the KM was ready for its first full-scale trials. But the logistics were a nightmare. The craft was built in Gorky, now Nizhny Novgorod, nearly 1,500 kilometers from the Caspian Sea. It was too wide for the canals and too heavy for the roads. The Soviets moved it in pieces, covered in heavy camouflage netting, traveling only at night. They moved it down the Volga River, telling locals it was a damaged ship being moved for scrap. Once it reached the secret facility at Kaspiask, the real work began. The year 1967 marked the first time the monster truly breathed. Imagine the scene: 8 Dobrynin VD7 turbojet engines, each producing 28,000 pounds of thrust, mounted on the forward fuselage. These engines weren't just for propulsion, they were tilted downward during takeoff. They blasted air directly under the wings to inflate the air cushion, allowing the 540-ton hull to unstuck itself from the water's surface tension. The test pilots were a unique breed. They had to be trained as both sea captains and fighter pilots. The KM didn't have a traditional steering wheel, it had a flight yoke, but the response times were sluggish, like a supertanker. During the 1967 trials, the KM reached speeds of 550 km per hour, 340 miles per hour. To the Soviet military observers, it was a revelation. It could fly in sea states that would ground a seaplane and destroy a hydrofoil. It was invisible to the radar technology of 1967, which was calibrated to filter out objects moving close to the sea surface to avoid sea clutter. The Soviets realized they had a weapon that could cross the Atlantic in hours, carrying enough troops to seize an entire coastline, and no radar in the world would see it coming until it was too late. Chapter 5, From Monster to Avenger, the Lun Class and the Carrier Killer Doctrine. While the KM was a massive laboratory for Rostislav Alexeyev, the Soviet military wanted a weapon. By the early 1970s, the monster had proven that ground effect was viable. The result was the Lun-class Ekranoplan, perhaps the most menacing-looking vessel ever to touch the water. The Lun was slightly smaller than the KM but far more sophisticated. It was 73 meters long and powered by 8 Kuznetsov NK-87 turbofans. But its most striking feature was the 6 massive tubes mounted on its back. These were launchers for the P-270 Moskit, SSN-22 Sunburn, anti-ship missiles. The Moskit was a terrifying weapon. It traveled at Mach 3 at sea-skimming altitudes, making it nearly impossible for Western Aegis defense systems to intercept. A single Lun, moving at 500 km per hour, could approach a U.S. Navy carrier strike group, fire a volley of 6 missiles from 100 km away, and disappear before the first missile even hit its target. The Soviet naval doctrine for the Lun was saturation in speed. They envisioned a fleet of these carrier killers prowling the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. However, weaponizing an Ekranoplan presented a nightmare for engineers. When a Moskit missile was fired, the massive exhaust from the missile's rocket motor would enter the jet engines of the Lun, potentially causing a flameout. Alexeyev's team had to design complex baffling systems and modify the firing sequences to ensure the Dragon didn't choke on its own fire. Chapter 6, The Fatal Stall, Anatomy of the 1980 Disaster. For 15 years, the original KM, the monster itself, had survived the harsh conditions of the Caspian. But in 1980, the luck of the prototype ran out. Rostislav Alexeyev had been removed from the project due to political infighting, leaving the testing in the hands of pilots who, while talented, lacked the creator's intuitive grasp of the machine's quirks. On December 15, 1980, the KM took off for a routine test flight. The weather was far from ideal, the Caspian was agitated, with heavy swells and a thick mist. During a high-speed maneuver, the pilot attempted to gain altitude too quickly. In a standard aircraft, pulling back on the stick increases lift. In an Ekranoplan, pulling back too sharply shifts the center of pressure, COP, behind the center of gravity, COG. The KM began to porpoise, it surged upward, leaving the safety of the ground effect cushion. The air under the wings vanished. The nose pitched up to a critical angle, and the 540-ton beast stalled. It slammed into the water with a force of 15 g. The structural rivets, already weakened by years of saltwater corrosion, sheared off. The hull cracked like an eggshell. Miraculously, the crew survived the initial impact and escaped. But the monster did not. It floated for nearly a week, a broken titan in the middle of a cold sea. Because of the intense secrecy surrounding the project, the Soviet Navy hesitated to send a massive rescue operation that might be spotted by Western satellites. They watched from a distance as the waves slowly filled the KM's fuselage. On the seventh day, the Caspian Sea Monster slipped beneath the surface, settling on the seabed where it remains today, a rusted monument to a lost era. Chapter 7: Western Paranoia, the CIA's Tactical Response. While the KM was sinking in the Caspian, the halls of the Pentagon were buzzing with fear. Declassified documents from the late 70s and early 80s revealed that the CIA had initiated Project West Wing Phase 2. They weren't just observing anymore, they were trying to figure out how to kill the monster. The primary issue was radar horizon. Traditional shipborne radar travels in a straight line, but the Earth is curved. An object flying at 5 meters altitude remains below the radar horizon until it is roughly 25 to 30 kilometers away. For a craft moving at 500 kilometers per hour, that gives the defender less than 3 minutes to identify, track, and fire. The U.S. military considered several radical counters. The Sea Sentry program, a proposal for tethered balloons, aerostats, equipped with downward-looking radar to look over the horizon. Hydrofoil interceptors. The U.S. developed the Pegasus-class hydrofoils, hoping their high speed and maneuverability could catch an Ekranoplan, but they were still half as fast as the Soviet machines. Acoustic triangulation. Because the KM's 10 jet engines produced a sound signature that could be heard for 50 miles, the Navy experimented with underwater hydrophone arrays that could detect the atmospheric pressure waves hitting the water's surface. The CIA's greatest fear was that the Soviets would build a nuclear-powered Ekranoplan. With infinite range, a nuclear monster could circle the globe indefinitely, hiding in the radar shadows of the world's oceans, ready to launch a nuclear strike with zero warning. Chapter 8: The Orlyonok, the Amphibious Revolution. Realizing that the 540-ton KM was too large for practical use, Alexeyev's bureau produced the A-90 Orlyonok, Eaglet. If the KM was a monster and the Lun was a dragon, the Orlyonok was the workhorse. It was 58 meters long and designed specifically for rapid amphibious assault. The Orlyonok featured a unique dual-mode propulsion system. It had 2 turbofans in the nose for takeoff, to create the air cushion, and a massive Kuznetsov NK-12 turboprop, the most powerful turboprop in the world, mounted on the tail for cruising. What made the Orlyonok a masterpiece was its ability to transition from water to land. Its nose would swing open like a giant jaw, and a ramp would extend. Within minutes, it could unload 2 BTR armored personnel carriers or 150 fully armed paratroopers directly onto a beach. It didn't need a port. It didn't need a runway. It could fly over minefields and coastal defenses. During one test, an Orlyonok lost its entire tail section after hitting a wave. In any other aircraft, this would be a death sentence. But because it was in ground effect, the pilot was able to keep the craft surfing on its air cushion and limped back to base at low speed. It proved that despite their complexity, Ekranoplans possessed a strange, rugged survivability. However, even the Orlyonok couldn't survive the collapse of the Soviet economy. By the early 90s, the Eaglets were grounded, their engines sold for scrap, and their hulls left to bleach in the sun. Chapter 9: The Rust of Empires, the Post-Soviet Decay. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 didn't just end a political era, it froze time for the Ekranoplan. As the ruble plummeted and the vast military-industrial complex of the USSR was carved up, the secret bases at Kaspiask fell into a state of surreal desolation. The Lun, the carrier killer we discussed earlier, sat bobbing in the brackish water of the Caspian for nearly 3 decades. Without the constant maintenance required to fight the corrosive effects of saltwater on duralumin hulls, the Dragon began to rot. Its once fearsome Moskid missile tubes became nesting grounds for local birds. For years, the only people who saw the monster's successor were local fishermen and adventurous urban explorers who smuggled themselves into the restricted zones. During this period, Rostislav Alexeyev's bureau, the Central Hydrofoil Design Bureau, struggled to survive by pivoting to small, civilian Ekranoplans. They proposed sea buses and rescue craft, but the world wasn't ready to invest in a technology that seemed like a relic of a failed superpower. The knowledge, however, didn't vanish. While the hardware was rusting, the blueprints were being digitized. Engineers who had worked on the KM and the Lun began to consult for international firms, quietly whispering the secrets of ground effect physics into the ears of a new generation of designers. Chapter 10: The Strategic Rebirth. Why 2026? Why is the Sea Monster back in the headlines in 2026? The answer lies in the shifting geography of global conflict and commerce. In the 20th century, the focus was on the European plains. In the 21st century, the focus has shifted to the Indo-Pacific. The Pacific Ocean is a vast expanse where traditional transport faces a speed versus volume crisis. Cargo ships are slow, taking weeks to cross the ocean. Transport planes are fast but cannot carry the heavy armor or the massive tonnage required for sustained operations without specialized, vulnerable runways. Enter the Liberty Lifter. In 2023, DARPA, the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, officially greenlit a project that Alexeyev would have recognized instantly. The goal? To create a long-range, low-cost X-plane capable of seaborne takeoff and landing, designed specifically to operate in ground effect. The 2026 models of these craft aren't trying to be monsters for the sake of ego. They are designed for island-hopping logistics. Unlike the KM, which struggled with rough seas, modern versions utilize active control systems. Using LiDAR and high-speed sensors, these craft can read the waves ahead of them, adjusting their flaps and engine thrust in milliseconds to maintain a stable air cushion even in high-sea states. The monster is no longer a clumsy beast, it has become a precision instrument. Chapter 11: The Technical Leap, Solving the Stability Paradox. The primary reason the original KM crashed in 1980 was the stability paradox. In the 1960s, maintaining the perfect altitude was a manual task. A pilot had to physically feel the cushion. If they pulled back too hard, the aerodynamic center would shift, leading to a fatal pitch-up. In 2026, we have solved this through three major technological pillars. Fly-by-wire AI. Modern Ekranoplans do not have a direct mechanical link between the pilot and the wings. Instead, an AI flight controller sits in the middle. It prevents the pilot from making the Logachev error. It physically will not allow the craft to pitch up past the safety threshold of the ground effect zone. Composite materials. The KM was built of heavy marine aluminum. Today, we use carbon fiber reinforced polymers, CFRP. This reduces the empty weight by nearly 40%, allowing for a much larger payload-to-fuel ratio. Variable geometry exhaust. Alexeyev's power-augmented RAM (PAR) technology using the front engines to blow air under the wings has been refined. Modern engines use vectoring nozzles to precisely control the pressure under the wing, allowing these craft to hover momentarily or take off from much shorter stretches of water than the original 1967 prototype. These aren't just incremental changes, they are the fundamental fixes that turn a suicide machine into a reliable transport vessel. The physics hasn't changed since 1966, but our ability to manage those physics has finally matured. Chapter 12: Conclusion: The Ghost in the Machine. As we conclude this episode of Synapse Daily, we have to ask, what is the true legacy of the Caspian Sea Monster? For some, it remains a symbol of Cold War hubris, of white elephant that consumed billions of rubles and lives for a dream that never quite realized its potential. But for the engineers and visionaries of 2026, the KM was a message from the future. Rostislav Alexeyev wasn't a mad scientist, he was an explorer who found a third way to travel. He found the ghost space between the air and the water. Today, the Lun has been towed to a beach in Derbent, Russia, where it will serve as the centerpiece of a military theme park. It sits on the sand, its massive missile tubes pointed at a sky it will never touch again. But while that specific machine is a museum piece, the idea is more alive than ever. From the secret labs of DARPA to the commercial shipping lanes of the South China Sea, the monster is being reborn. We are moving toward a world where the barriers between land, sea, and air are increasingly blurred. The story of the KM reminds us that progress is rarely a straight line. It is a series of surges, failures, and long silences. The monster had to sleep for 40 years so that the world could develop the computers and materials needed to tame it. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the history and the future of the Hazar Denizi Canavari. We explore the intersection of history, science, and the human spirit. I'm your host, and this was the story of the Caspian Sea Monster, the ghost that refused to stay under the waves.